All right, so let's go ahead and start on the reading for Chapter 5, Lesson 1. You should have already finished watching the video, so let's go ahead and get into the reading here. It says, essential question for Lesson 1 is, how did the American Revolution start? So we're going to start there. It's the battles of Lexington and Concord. By 1775, the colonists were tired of British taxes and oppression. After some violent encounters with British troops, the colonists began stockpiling arms and gunpowder in Lexington and Concord, two towns near Boston, Massachusetts. Paul Revere writes, on April 18th of 1775, British General Thomas Gage ordered 700 soldiers from Boston to seize and destroy colonial war supplies and to arrest Patriot leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Gage's plan was to make a surprise attack on Lexington and Concord, so he gave his troops orders not to allow any colonists to leave Boston that night. Little did General Gage know that a small group of patriots had learned of his plan to attack the two towns. Under cover of night, Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott set out to warn the people in the area. Revere arrived at Lexington around midnight. When a guard for Adams and Hancock asked him not to make so much noise, Revere told him, "You'll have noise enough before long. The regulars, or the British troops, are coming." So this is a picture here. It says Revere set out at night to warn of Britain's plan to attack. And that's what this picture here is showing. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at our timeline for this lesson. So we have December of 1773. The Boston Tea Party dumps tea into Boston Harbor. In May of 1775, we have the Second Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia. In April of 1775, the fighting begins at Lexington. And then in June of 1775, we have the Battle of Bunker Hill. So the picture here is showing an engraving of the Battle of Lexington. So the Battle at Lexington. When the British troops reached Lexington, Captain John Parker was waiting with the local militia. Massachusetts relied on the militia and other volunteer soldiers called the Minutemen when emergency troops were needed. John Robbins, one of the colonial militiamen, described the sight of the British advancing. There appeared a number of the king's troops at the distance of about 60 or 70 yards from us, and on a quick pace towards us. The first shots. Captain Parker's orders to the militia were very simple. Don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. As the distance between the two groups grew smaller, someone in one of the groups fired a shot. To this day, no one knows which side fired first, but other shots quickly followed. Even though the battle lasted only a few minutes, 8 militiamen were killed. The British succeeded in taking Lexington and marched on to Concord. Arriving in Concord. Dr. Samuel Prescott, one of the men working with Paul Revere, had warned Concord of the impending attack. The townspeople moved most of the arms and gunpowder to nearby towns. When the British arrived, they found only the few supplies the townspeople of Concord had not had time to hide. By now, the church bells were ringing loudly to alert the local farmers of the British attack. The Concord rebels turned on the British troops. Minutemen, local farmers, and townspeople fired at the British troops from behind fences, houses, and trees. The British troops were forced to retreat back to Boston, 18 miles away. By the time they reached safety, more than 90 British soldiers had been killed and 174 were wounded. With these two battles, The war for American independence had begun. So here's a British heard that the Americans were holding large amounts of weapons at Concord, and so that's why they went to attack to destroy those weapons. But the colonists were able to take those weapons and move them to other places, to other nearby towns before the British were able to come and seize the weapons. So let's go and take a look at the map skills here. So it says routes to Lexington and Concord. I'm going to go ahead and zoom out so you can see the map a little better. So we can go ahead and take a look here. You can see there's Boston here, and then here's Lexington, here's Concord. So it kind of puts it in perspective for you. So if you look at Revere's route, it's in the purple here. Okay, so you can see the purple route here, and then when it gets to dotted, which is right here, that's when Prescott continued Paul Revere's route. So Paul Revere stopped here at Lexington, told them, warned them about the British troops, and then continued on, and then Prescott also continued on there. And if you look at the blue route, that was Dawes' route, and that was his route to help warn the colonists of the British troops coming. And then the British route, you can see here in red, and they crossed the harbor here, and then went on land to Lexington and then Concord. Okay, so again, you can see the American forces and the British forces, and you can see kind of where they were there to attack. Let's go and continue the reading with the Second Continental Congress. The leaders of the 13 colonies had known a war with Great Britain was possible. They had already met in 1774 in the First Continental Congress to decide what to do about the recent taxes set by the British government. Great speakers such as Patrick Henry had given fiery speeches to urge the leaders to prepare to separate from Great Britain. The Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia on May 10th of 1775, so about a year after the First Continental Congress, just days after the battles of Lexington and Concord. Participants sent from each of the 13 colonies had to decide how to respond to what had happened. They decided that they had to prepare for war. First, they made the militia that had stood up to the British in Massachusetts part of an official Continental Army. To lead that army, they nominated a veteran of the French and Indian War and a member of the Congress, George Washington. Washington did not think he was up to the task of commanding the entire army, but he agreed to do his best. So this says Congress Voting Independence by Robert Pine and Edward Savage. And so you can see this picture here. So let's go and look at this primary source from George Washington. It says, in their words, George Washington, though I am truly sensible of the high honor done me in this appointment, yet I feel great distress from a consciousness that my abilities and military experience may not be equal to the extensive and important trust. However, as the Congress desire it, I will enter upon the momentous duty and exert every power I possess in their service and for the support of the glorious cause. And that was George Washington's address to the Continental Congress in June of 1775, whenever they said, I think you should be the head of our army. And George Washington is like, I'm not sure I can handle it, but if that's what you want, then I will do my very best. The Second Continental Congress was not just a single meeting. It began as a series of meetings during the spring and summer of 1775. Besides establishing a Continental Army, the members also elected a president, John Hancock, and drafted the Olive Branch Petition. This was an attempt to resolve the conflicts between the colonies and Great Britain. However, King George III refused to receive the Congress's peace offering. As Great Britain's grip on the colonies weakened, the Continental Congress became the unofficial government. The war was far from over, but the colonists were learning how to govern themselves. The members would continue to meet throughout the war and even afterwards to make important decisions for the 13 colonies. Continuing with the Battle of Not Bunker Hill. On June 18th of 1775, James Warren, a Boston colonist, explained the conflict in Boston to his wife, Mercy Otis Warren. It is impossible to describe the confusion in this place. Women and children flying into the country, armed men going to the field, and wounded men filled the streets. British General Thomas Gage decided to occupy the hills around Boston. Word about the British plan spread quickly. Colonel William Prescott and General Israel Putnam led 1,000 colonial troops to the hills north of Boston across the Charles River. The original plan was to fortify Bunker Hill, which means to build earthen walls around it. This way, the colonists could fire cannons at the British troops stationed across the Charles River in Boston. Instead, the colonists decided to protect Breed's Hill, which was closer to the river. The colonists worked all night to build a fort for protection. So they thought they were going to fortify Bunker Hill, but instead they actually fortified Breed's Hill. So this battle is actually misnamed. The battle begins. British troops crossed the Charles River by boat and marched up Breed's Hill. The militia and civilians, or ordinary citizens, waited, hidden behind the walls they had built. The colonists did not have much ammunition, or musket balls and gunpowder. Officers told them not to waste ammunition by firing at the British soldiers who were too far away. Historians say that either Colonel Prescott or General Israel Putnam said, "Don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes." So what that means is when you look at somebody from far away, you can't see the white part of their eye, but as you get closer, you can see that white part of their eye. So it's saying don't shoot until they're close enough to see the white part of their eye because they didn't want to waste the ammunition. Continuing on, a British victory. Twice, the British charged up the hill only to be stopped by the militia. Both times, they were forced down by gunfire. After a third try, the British overwhelmed the colonists. The British won the battle, but the victory was costly. More than 1,000 soldiers were killed or wounded. Although the battle occurred on Breed's Hill, it became known as the Battle of Bunker Hill. Great Britain was one of the most powerful nations on earth, but winning a war against the colonists would not be easy. So you can see in the map here, you can see where Breed's Hill is, and you can see where Bunker Hill is. And this is where the battle actually took place, but this is what it was named after. Let's go and take a quick look at the infographic here. So we have soldiers of the American Revolution. So we have the Minutemen, and this would be what the Minutemen would mostly dress in. It says the citizen soldiers in the local militia didn't have uniforms. Instead, they wore their own clothes. Because the Minutemen were the first ones to arrive for battle, many of the colonies made an effort to arm them with the muskets and other supplies. Minutemen had the advantage over the British troops of being familiar with the frontier, hunting, and knowing what the local land was like. So the Minutemen might have worn a hat. So whatever hat they would have owned, a waistcoat and coat. So it says a sleeveless and collarless waistcoat was worn over a man's shirt. Waistcoats were usually made of linen or wool, and men wore a coat over their waistcoat. These overcoats were usually made of heavy linen or wool. Now we have breeches. So knee breeches were common in the 18th century. These came just below the knee and were closed with ties or buttons. Breeches were made of leather, wool, or linen. And then they were usually armed with a musket. So it says a good soldier could load and fire his musket 3 times per minute. Muskets weren't very accurate and didn't work well in wet weather. So let's go and take a look at the British soldiers, which were called the Redcoats. The British Redcoats were all issued uniforms and muskets. Because battlefields of the 18th century could be smoky and confusing, the soldiers wore red. This way, British soldiers wouldn't have trouble separating friend from foe. The Redcoats had the advantage of military training and better equipment over the colonial Minutemen. So they have a hat also. Hats identified which regiment a soldier belonged to. They would have had a musket. The British soldiers' land pattern musket was standard issue. Soldiers would affix a bayonet or attachable blade, right here at the top, to the musket's muzzle for close combat. Buttons. So it says there could be as many as 36 or 36 buttons on a soldier's uniform. Buttons often had the name of the soldier's regiment inscribed on them. Buttons had to be polished regularly. And then it says facings. So these visible linings along the edge of the soldier's coat were colored to show the regiment he belonged to. So you can see the colors there.